Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi wa kafa, salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da wa ba'd. Alhamdulillah, we are hoping to make it today from 966 to 1099 AH. That's covering a lot of ground in a short period of time because the historical events start to multiply by leaps and bounds. If we think that we've covered a lot of material, a lot of things that happened, it's going to start to become more so in these classes. Now we're starting from 966 to 986. There was huge flooding in Hadramaut in Yemen in 970 AH, and it destroyed numerous homes, and many people were made homeless. In the year 971 AH, there was also a huge flood in Mecca, so much so that the Yemeni corner of the Kaaba was actually drenched, and many of the people died. So there was sort of a small, almost tsunami-type wave, and it killed some of the people that were in the masjid during that time. In 918 AH, and I just wanted to mention about these two because they're significant, these events, before we delve too deeply into the other things. They're significant and they're important. Now, it's listed as 918, but actually, I wanted to sort of run back through who the Khulafa were very quickly before we came to the current Khalifa. Now, in 918, this brought the death of the first Khan, or Khan the First. He was the 8th Ottoman Khalifa. This in turn brought to power another Khalifa. Salim I was in power as the 9th Khalifa, and the 8th Khalifa was Bayazid. Bayazid came to power after the death of Muhammad al-Fatih, who was also known as Muhammad II or Muhammad al-Thani. He'd sent out the Ottoman navy to save the lives of Muslims and Jews under the Reconquista of Spain and offered them safe passage to Ottoman government. He used to openly mock the Spanish monarchs for kicking out their intelligentsia, while his own infrastructure was built up by Jewish, Muslim, and Aryan subjects in his empire. Now, this is particularly significant because the fact of Bayazid, the reason why Bayazid was so significant is because he accepted all of the intelligentsia of the Jews, of the Christians who happened to be Aryans in their theology. We discussed Aryan theology before. He accepted them without putting any preconditions. And these noblemen and nobles happened to be the courtesans, the high-level people of his society. And it's the same thing that happens when people become Muslim. In general, when people convert to Islam in these societies, it tends to be the intelligentsia. Muslims don't get as much junk as what the kuffar get from us when one of ours apostates. So when you look at the Muslims that have gone over to atheism or what have you and apostated, most of them are our junk, our garbage. But when you look at the people that have become Muslim, the great bulk of them are their intelligentsia. They're doctors, they're scientists, they're scholars, they're philosophers. I mean, looking at Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, that was a major blow for him to convert to Islam. Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall was a lord. He was in the House of Lords. That was a massive blow. To have him come back after having studied for years away, dressed as a Muslim, and enter into the House of Lords and invite all of the honored gentlemen to Islam. That's shocking for them, right? That's what happens. So Bayazid was bringing in people and building up this huge infrastructure. So the Jewish golden age that had been in Andalus, as Andalus was crumbling and cracking, you started to find that golden age transferring into North Africa. If you look at most of the scholarly resources of the Jews from the Middle Ages, after Andalus, which they're calling Spain. After that period, the most influential literature for Jews is coming from North Africa. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known as Rambam, it was based in Egypt. One of his descendants was a doctor to Salah ad-Din. Rambam and Moshe, there was another Rabbi Nachmanides, or Rabbi Nachman. All of these different people were either North Africans or pulling from North African sources. Good bulk of them. The Arian Christians, Arius himself was a Berber. And so all of this is coming back into North Africa. The Ottomans have taken North Africa, and all of that knowledge and breadth and scholarship is coming into them. And he's using that to build up palaces, masjids, refurbishing hospitals, and the Western world in Europe begins to decay. And this is what happened. Now in 974 AH, you look at the next Khalifa that came after Salim I. Salim I was the 9th Khalifa. The 10th Khalifa was Suleiman Khan ibn Salim Khan, the 10th Ottoman Khalifa. He had been given the Khilafah in the year 926 AH after the death of his father, Sultan Salim Khan. Sultan Suleiman was also known as Suleiman al-Awwal, or Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman the Lawgiver, Suleiman al-Qanuni, the Lawgiver. He was the longest reigning of the Ottomans, ruling for a fantastic 46 years. There have been studies written by kuffar, not Muslims. Put the Muslims out of the equation for a second. Kuffar have written multi-volume studies on Suleiman al-Awwal's administration because of how successful he was. Let's just talk about him very briefly, what he did. I had mentioned before that Columbus and other explorers were sent out not for finding new places and bringing back good things and giving glad tidings to people. They were sent out to find alternative trade routes so they did not have to trade with Muslims. Number two, they were trying to corner the market on any spices or new natural resources that they found. They began to build up their fleets, and they started to build up a huge maritime industry. When they started spreading eastward to try to take over India and other places, and Frankish pirates began prowling across the Mediterranean, the Mamluks were unsuccessful in stopping them, not because the Mamluks weren't good fighters. The Mamluks were remarkable fighters, but they weren't sailors. They weren't maritime people. They did not come from a seafaring people. And that's why the Mamluks had difficulty faring against them. Once they came ashore and it was a ground war, well, then you all know what the result was going to be. But when it came to seafaring adventures, because of the unpredictability of storms, waves, all these other things, learning how to use the astrolabe, that's not what the Mamluks did. The Ottomans were different. Suleiman al-Awwal built a huge fleet, probably the largest maritime fleet that had ever been known of. Most of the history books mention that they don't even know how many ships he had commissioned. People make reference to him cutting down forests. That's how much wood that he wanted in order to make as many ships as were needed. He wanted them sleek. He wanted them to be fast. He wanted them to be positionally accurate and movable, aerodynamic. He wanted them to be the best. Because when Salim, his father, was in power, Salim al-Awwal, he was thinking about securing the borders of India and spreading further eastward and actually moving into China. And he was just about to do that when he died suddenly at 50 years of age. Suleiman al-Awwal, he was different. He was actually looking towards Europe. He was looking westward. Totally different from his father. Looking westward, securing the western borders, trying to show back up at Tours, where some of the early Muslims had shown up and been driven back in Vienna. He wanted to show up again. It's Suleiman that brought Islam on a much deeper level into the Balkans, the area that we're now calling Yugoslavia, which is a fake nation that was made up. There are no Yugoslavian people racially. It was Marshal Tito forcing Muslims, Orthodox Christians from the Croatians and the Serbian Orthodox Church, none of whom get along, to live under one secular empire. And this secular, prosthetic, synthetic, fake country was called Yugoslavia. Although no one could ever find out what Yugoslavian sounded like, because no one spoke it. What does Yugoslavian sound like? Just as much as what does Pakistani sound like? It's the same principle. Big, massive secular nation, try to water down the faith of all the peoples. Now, Suleiman, he also did something else. He gathered together all of the legal precepts that the Ottomans used, and he wanted them written out in a simple, systematic fashion. This is why it was called Al-Qanuni. Al-Qanuni, the lawgiver, not because he was making laws and legislating, but because he systematized them. He told some of the qadis that were Hanafis to simplify their books. He said, you must simplify these books, or no one will be able to follow this. You have to simplify the books. So they simplified them. Then he took the books from the other three schools, and he wrote out a destur. Destur now, the Arabs are now using it for the word constitution. That's not what destur meant back then. Destur meant ratification. And what he did is each set of laws he wrote in a canonized form. And so every qadi would have detailed knowledge of the Sharia and detailed knowledge of the leftover pieces of Sharia of the Jews and Christians. So if Jews and Christians came into court, or a Jew came into court, for example, on the Passover, he would know why Jewish witnesses wouldn't be there. They're not going to be there on Sukkot, on Passover, on the high holy days, so he wouldn't hold them in contempt if they were due to come to court for a libel issue. He wouldn't hold them in contempt. Why? Because he knew in their bits and pieces of leftover Sharia that they don't come out during those times. On the Sabbath, they wouldn't hold it during those times. Christians on Orthodox holidays, right? It's systematized everything that was understood. Many of the scholars in that time period, and most of the welis, the governors, most of the mayors and other people spoke at least 5 languages. It was something that was just required. You could not be monolingual. You couldn't afford to be monolingual. He also spread the Ottoman Dawla, the Ottoman governance, in a huge way, and made sure to incorporate, because by systematizing everything into a series of books that could just be referred to, he made it actually possible to rule over such a huge amount of people. I mean, any one time he was ruling over perhaps 4 continents. A lot of people will say that the British Empire is the largest empire there ever was. I disagree. I believe the Ottomans were huge. The British Empire, I say, was not the biggest empire because it used its own currency, and you could not become a member or a subject within that empire, no matter how hard you worked, if you did not fit certain classifications, one of them being lack of melanin. If you did not have that, you were not considered a full-fledged citizen. The Ottomans incorporated, whenever they came into an area, they would take on that currency as part of their area. They would use 4, 5, 6 currencies. They would take on whatever language was from that area. They would incorporate whatever people were there. and bring them into them. And so that's why the Ottomans were really the largest empire, because people under the Ottomans did not feel neglected and said, well, I'm not treated as the others are. They were all brought under one huge system. He was called the lawgiver not for legislating laws, but for his complete revamping of the Ottoman codes of practice to make them user-friendly. His methods would last for 300 years after his time. Suleiman al-Qanuni also went to Sham and saw Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. And every 15 years, he had the walling and the cobblestones demolished and relaid. Every 15 years. Because he said, there is no reason why these places should not look every bit as splendorous as how we've made Mecca and Medina look. There's no reason why they shouldn't look like that. Right? I don't even have to explain to you how pathetic the state of the cobblestones on the way to the Dome or Masjid al-Aqsa are, where some of our believers have to have their hands out like beggars in order to get it fixed, because the Jordanian authorities, who don't even deserve mention, have failed to use the money swelling their coffers from the induced slavery they've brought on themselves to the Americans. They haven't fixed it. Also, Suleiman al-Awwal marched in and oversaw the expansion of Ottoman territories into Belgrade, Rhodes, and a huge portion of Hungary before finally being rebuffed at the Battle of Vienna. If not for his being checked, Germany and other Teuton peoples would be Muslims today. So, on your flight to Frankfurt, you would have had halal sauerkraut of all types, halal sausages of all types, because they all would have been Muslim. There would have been no Hitler. There would have been no Bismarck. There would have been no Paul von Hindenburg. There would have been no Wehrmacht state. Wouldn't have been any. There would have been a huge Ottoman domain. They were finally checked at Vienna. And I'll tell you why. There are two reasons why. One is Ottomans tended to rely in ground warfare on the use of their cannons, because they knew that the Christian forces and other armies marched in a phalanx fashion, several men across, several men deep. They would fire 4 cannons lined up into the crowd. You're going to win that war because everyone's lined up. And so they're firing cannons 4 or 5 times into the crowd. Well, there's going to be hardly anyone left, and those that are left will surrender. And they'll be killed or taken as prisoner, what have you. So they couldn't get the cannons all the way into Vienna because they had to drag them over hillocks and mountains. They couldn't bring them with them. And then secondly, while they were at the gates, pounding them down, using battering rams. And what they had done is they'd taken a bundle of kindling with wood planks, poured oil over it. Yes, they had oil back then. They were using a type of kerosene and pitch. Set it on fire and were ramming it against the gate. So one of two things would happen. They would either burn the whole place down and get inside, or bust the door open with this barn buster object, burn everyone in front of the door who was a guard, and get inside anyway. And they were ramming it against this massive gate. And a letter comes telling them that some of the local Shia rebels back in their area were advancing on a number of Ottoman provinces. And then all of a sudden, the Ottomans just pulled back. They just, according to the accounts of the Kuffar, they say that they melted back into the ether of where they had come from. Just that quick, they were gone. And, 1 minute, the gate's on fire, it's being rammed. And next thing you know, the fire goes out. Gate's not being rammed anymore. Massive army of 100,000 people is gone. I mean, we must remember, he didn't raise the largest army, Suleiman al-Qanuni. There was, before him, Muhammad I rose an army by some accounts that's mentioned as being 500,000 when they marched on Romania. That is a massive army. Huge. So when they melted back into the ether of where they came from, where were they going? Well, back to the provinces that were being threatened by the Twelvers. They had to go back there, stop the war with, and this, according to some of the ulama that mention it, shows that it is a greater obligation to fight the people of bid'ah than the unbelievers. And when faced with a choice between having to fight either one of them, it is more imperative that you fight the cultist than the unbeliever. It is imperative that you fight them. It is more severe that you fight them. They are worse in their harm than the unbeliever. The Jew or the Christian is clear. The Orthodox Jew in Golders Green or Stamford Hill or Brisbane or Los Angeles or New York City or Williamsburg near Brooklyn. He has the black hat, the strimmel tied around it, the big beard, the peot, the kaftan jacket. He's obviously not Muslim. The Christian, whether he's Catholic or any myriad of Protestant offshoots, you can tell these people aren't Muslim and they don't say they're Muslim. What about the one that says, not only am I Muslim, this is the only true Islam? And you have a group of laymen, children, women that are vulnerable. That's why they're more dangerous. So for this reason, the Ottomans moved back. Now the 11th Khalifa came in 974 AH, Salim II, the 11th Khalifa of the Ottoman governance, came in. Salim II focused on administration rather than fighting and other military activities, and would often just send out his soldiers or generals to do the fighting. This was totally uncharacteristic of the Ottomans. Suleiman al-Qanuni fought in most of his own battles. There were only a few where he was too ill to attend. He fought consistently, even as an old man. And all of the pictures or portraits that are done of him, even in his old age, show this massive, towering man with this big beard, well built, usually carrying a sword or one of his attendants with him carrying one. He was constantly engaged and involved in the affairs of the state. Constantly involved. To the point where even now, if you look at pictures of his mausoleum, you can tell that whoever is buried in there is someone important because of the way it's built up, because of the way that it is the center of all the other buildings around it. You can tell this, whoever's here must have been some type of ruler or prince or king. I don't know who it was, but whoever they were someone important. That gives you an example of understanding how Suleiman al-Qanuni was, or Suleiman al-Awwal. He was the last of the Ottomans to administrate directly for a long, long time. His reforms lasted for 300 years. Systematic, right? Streamlined better pensions for the soldiers. Streamlined better health care. Streamlined, by this time, they had contained polio in the Ottoman territories like how it's contained now in these countries in the Western world. Vaccinations were commonplace. Education was commonplace. The way it was is you just learned 3 languages when you were young. That's just the way the world was. You had to learn 3 languages. You just did. It's the way the world was. Salim II was unable to stop the swelling Russian Empire and the grip of the Tsar increasing, but was able to spread his influence by conquering El-Hijaz, Yemen, and Cyprus. Spain and Italy would be 2 military losses on his record, and this was partially due to not securing the Mediterranean as much as possible. In spite of all the difficulties and military setbacks, his reign was fairly stable. Now, it's mentioned that he was unable to stop the swelling Russian Empire and the grip of the Tsar. Now, the expressional use of the word Tsar came much later, but I'm using the word Tsar as just a word for the Russian emperors in general. I'm not using it because this is when the Tsar started. I'm just using it as a word for the Russian emperors in general. The Russian Empire at this time was building up. it's important that we understand one of the greatest incentives for Russian expansion was when they became literate. That was one of the most important things that ever happened in Russian history. The Cyrillic alphabet was written out and invented by Saint Cyril. They call him Saint Cyril. In order to enable Russians to read the Bible. But in addition to having that alphabet to read the Bible, obviously people write poetry, they write history, and that made the Russians a literate people. They became cultured. One of the things that writing does for a people, it gives them history, depth, breadth, culture, hindsight, history, an understanding of short and long-term goals. When you have a written language, you can see the development of a people. You can't name a single outstanding civilization in the world that doesn't have some sort of writing. The Yanomamos are a people, but with no written alphabet, they never progressed beyond Venezuela and some of the other areas where they're in. They're almost extinct because they have no written alphabet. In the year 979 AH, the teacher of the Khalifa Salim II, Sheikh Khawaja Ata'ullah, died after being the chief judge of Istanbul and accompanying the Khalifa many times to teach him and advise him when he had questions. Gujarat was embroiled in tribulations in 980 AH when there were street battles between the Muslims and the unbelievers. So in this time, Gujarat was almost becoming a breakaway state. It was part of, in a sense that, because a lot of territories weren't directly under Ottoman control in which they had garrisons there, but their ulama would mention the Khalifa's name in the khutbah, and they would use the Khalifa's currency. And zakah was sent to the Khalifa to distribute to the poor. By knowing this, you could see that the Khalifa was considered by them to be their leader. It wasn't necessary that the Khalifa had to be physically present there, or that he had to have his soldiers physically present there. The people that would later become the Mughals, the Mughal Empire and others, they accepted his authority. They used his currency. They mentioned his name in the khutbah. They gave zakah. They gave tribute. They gave khiraj. They did all these things because he was the governor. And it's from them that you found the currency, the word really gained currency, or the expression, Dhillullahi fil ard, the shade of Allah in the earth. And a lot of people, they would hear this expression today in our anachronistic projections back in time with our fake purist Islam and say, oh, astaghfirullah, this is shirk. Not realizing that the Ottomans were quoting direct from a hadith in Ibn Abi Asim and graded as authentic by Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah, in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, As-sultanu dhillullahi fil ard. The sultan, the government, the governance, is the shade of Allah on earth. So they understood their role. They understood what it meant. And as a title, Sulaiman al-Awwal was actually called that, not by himself, but by many of his people in his time because of how great he was. He is most likely, after Uthman, who established the Ottoman era, the progenitor of it, Suleiman is probably the greatest Ottoman Khalifa there ever was. In 982 AH, the Khalifa of the Muslims, Salim II, died. At the same time he was breathing his last, Ottoman forces had regained Tunisia from Catholic Spain. So notice what happened. The Catholic crown does the Reconquista, expels 1.6 million Muslims later on, massive slaughtering campaigns, sends out Columbus. He finds the Qarib people and others and is disgusted to find that some of them are Muslim. So he comes back a year later in 1493, does slaughterings. The Spanish crown moves further into North Africa and tries to colonize North Africa, tries to colonize Tunisia. So they had to take back Tunisia from Catholic Spain. So for this reason, you'll find, even today, just a sliver of people that will not only know Italian, but some of them will know Spanish for some reason. Because that indelible imprint that was put by the devastation caused when they came in was just, it was felt on a deep level, on a very, very deep level. After him, the oath of allegiance was given to the 12th Ottoman Khalifa, Murad III. Murad III was the father of the sultans in the same way that Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was the father of the kings. All Ottoman rulers after him were the product of Murad III and his wife Sophia. Now this is important. Any Khalifas that came after him were somehow related to Murad III, just as Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the famous Khalifa who said, when you find a man who disagrees with my rule, make his head agree with my sword. This Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, every single Umayyad ruler after was related to him. All of the ones in Andalus that built up Andalus are from his progeny. So that's why he's called Abul Muluk, the father of the kings. Well, Murad III was called the same thing, the father of the Abu Salatin, the father of the sultans. Because every single Khalifa, up until the abolishment of it, was from his lineage. In 985 AH came aerial disturbances, and historians such as Ibn Imad and Jalaluddin al-Suyuti only noted them without a full understanding of what they were in reality. Again, whether we're calling them aerial disturbances or unidentified flying objects or what have you, there were these aerial disturbances. Now, there were some deaths during this time. One of them was Burhanuddin Ibrahim ibn Bakhsha, who was a Hanafi scholar who wrote numerous texts against homosexuality, hashish, speakeasies, and other evils in his time. He died in the year 966 AH. Ahmed ibn Hamid, who was a Hanafi judge in Halab. Muslihuddin al-Multawi, a Shafi'i judge in Malta. Shamsuddin ibn Durum, Hanafi scholar in Halab. Both of these ulama died in 968 AH. Burhanuddin ibn Muflih, Muslahuddin Basruri, who was a Hanafi judge from Kalibuli. Both died in 969 AH. Then there was Zainuddin ibn Nujaym, who was a Hanafi judge that died in 97 AH. You had Shihabuddin al-Ramli, the Shafi'i judge and student of Imam Zakaria. Radiyuddin ibn al-Hanbali, the historian and mathematician of Halab. Both of these died in 971 AH. Now, by this time, the Muslims were noting down history. They'd already been noting down history, but they also began to write about their own contemporary times. By Ibn Khaldun's time, and this may be an important point for some, by Ibn Khaldun's time, writing down history for Muslims was normal. The difference is Ibn Khaldun was the first to systematize it in a way in which we now look at it. When I told this to a professor in this country, he almost fell off of his chair. So to finish it, I brought in Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah and read to him from Arabic and translated, so that way he could actually hear for himself that while his progenitors were eating raw flesh or looking at the fire and trying to figure out what it was, or cave painting or whatever it is they were doing, history was a well-known science to the Muslims. And it's something that we can't have that lost on us. This to them is progress. The way that things are for these people that have built this up, this to them is progress. For us, this is decline. The Ottomans that had all these things, they were actually in decline. This to them is the pinnacle. For us, it's things are headed down now. And it makes you understand how we read history and how we understand the unfolding of history. Because of the social Darwinist construct They understand that things can only get better. The inexorable march of progress. Things can only get better. We're getting better. We're getting more complex. We're getting more noble. Whereas how the Muslim sees it is civilization was already at its pinnacle. And when idolatry came into the world, we started to enter into a slow decline, which every now and then would hit a plateau, but it would go in a stair-step pattern. That is totally different and affects how you view the world and how you do things. Further to this, other deaths during this time were As-Sayyid al-Sharif Abdul Rahman al-Bayruti, the Shafi'i judge and an immigrant to Damascus. He died in 972 AH. Ahmed ibn Alawi ibn Muhammad ibn Ali ibn Jahdab ibn Abdul Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Alawi ibn Ba'alawi al-Yamani. The great Shafi'i saint of Yemen died in 973 AH, and with this last name, Ba'alawi, he was obviously a patron saint of what we're calling the Ba'alawi Tariqah. Yemen has produced innumerable saints, from Uwais al-Qarni all the way till now. It is one of the amazing things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen that area, which is so desolate and so harsh in its climate, to produce some of the most good-natured and upright people. For some reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has just chosen it that way. We also have other ulama. Taqiyuddin Muhammad ibn Shihabuddin al-Futuhi, Hanbali judge in Egypt. He died in 979 AH. He wrote numerous documents in history, fiqh, and also helped to systematize the administration of Egypt, which we would later find out had been broken into Egypt and Sudan. During this time, there was just Bilad Masr. That's all there was, the land of Egypt. There were no Sudanese. There were no Sudanese nationalists. There was no Wafd party. There was just one Egypt. Now, Bilad Sudan was used to refer to South Egypt. So Sa'id Masr was referring to Upper Egypt, which was Aswan all the way down into Sudan. And Lower Egypt was referring to Aswan and up. You'll find many great ulama coming from Sa'id Masr. You have Imams like Sheikh Umar Abdul Rahman, Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. So many scholars coming from Sa'id Masr. Again, an area of mainly Bedouin encampments, quite desolate. But you look at Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, you look at all these different scholars that have been produced, and you can see that Allah has blessed them. Another was Abdullah ibn Sa'aduddin as-Sindi in 984 AH. Jamaluddin Muhammad Tahir al-Hindi, Hanafi chief of Hadith scholars in his time in 986 AH. Now during this time, when you wanted to study Hadith, if you were a Hanafi in Central Asia, you made the trek to Sind. Sind is where the Hadith scholars were. Sind is where the experts in the madhab were, with the exception of Istanbul. That's where you travel to. So you find a lot of ulama having this name, Hindi, Sindhi. The Sindhis were known for their knowledge of Hadith. It sounds almost, the room would almost fall into laughter if you suggested this now. But back then, Sindhis were known for their knowledge of Hadith. They were considered to have remarkable memories. They had amazing feats of memory where they would memorize several pages of a book by just glancing and flicking the pages and writing it down. And they would be right. So a lot of the scholars, again, we're going back to this Central Asian link. These Central Asian scholars of the Hanafi school left behind a huge legacy. We could not speak about history without later on mentioning Muhammad Hayat as-Sindi, who's one of the greatest Hanafi scholars that ever lived in recent history. As-Sindi, So many other ulama from Sindh. And it's your history. It's my history. It's our history. It's not just that the scholars were great in the Arab world. Central Asia was a major hub. And that's something to be proud of. Because this ummah is great all around. Now, in 989 AH, we had the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade, which would bring about the first global permanent race-based slavery. Now, this is important. There are numerous books dedicated to this topic that have been written by the black intelligentsia. The greatest living voice of the black intelligentsia and black intellectualism today is a man by the name of Michael Dyson. Anytime I have watched him speak, anytime I have seen him in any live discussion, he has metaphorically decapitated anyone that's spoken against him. He is one of the greatest voices of the black intelligentsia. He's written numerous books on some of the impact of the Atlantic slave trade. And he's also written books on the aftermath of it. Now, what is the Atlantic slave trade? Before we can discuss the Atlantic slave trade, because we have to talk about this, because 100 million people being enslaved or disappearing, that's a big number. If 1/3 of America was just wiped out, water supply got poisoned, nuclear bomb was dropped, some other providential incident occurred, that would be a massive news event. More than the 11th of September 2001 attacks. 100 million is a big number. But we must talk about the different types of slavery. There are 3 forms of slavery. 3 general forms of slavery. All other forms of slavery devolve from these. There are 3 forms of slavery. The first form is war slavery. POW. People are taken in battle, and they are either killed, ransomed, or taken into the population of the people that have defeated them in combat. This is war slavery. The second type of slavery is indentured slavery. It was often called serfdom. Someone owes you a large amount of money, and you tell them that they have to work it off. And every time they get close to clearing the debt, you mention that they haven't cleared the interest. And when they clear the interest, you say there's still something more left of the debt. Or when they're close to clearing the debt, you can see they're in trouble, and you tell them, I'll give you another loan for only 4 more years or 5 more years. And you wind up in a permanent form of indentured slavery. When you die, your debts obviously don't go with you. Your children inherit it, and their children. So you have whole families from their father getting into debt, women being in debt, children being in debt, slaves. The third form is what is known as race-based slavery, where you will enslave others because of a perceived inferiority within them. This may be their socioeconomic status. Their race is usually a clear marker because it's the easiest, it's the most distinguishable characteristic. But sometimes class is used. Sometimes the way that they speak the same language, what accent they use. So if someone were to resort to slavery and say, everyone that speaks English with a Yorkshire accent is inferior, And we are going to enslave those people. Although certainly the Yorkshire people don't have a race per se, but the accent is distinctive enough to where people can be singled out. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Quran, the second and third forms of slavery were denounced and negated. But the first was left. Why? Because there were bound to be more wars. We've already been told in the Quran and the Sunnah that there would be further wars in history. But prisoners of war or war slavery was revealed in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not be permanent, and that those people had to be incorporated in to the society. Take, for example, the Mamluks. They were a product of war slavery. They weren't Muslim. They became one of the greatest empires in world history. Why? Because they were incorporated into the Muslims. You can't tell the difference in Egypt between a Mamluk and a Copt. You can tell no difference between the two because they're that well integrated into society. The Mamluk is seen as Egyptian, and so is the Copt. They're both seen as Egyptians. War slavery was also something that occurred and that occurs when wars happen between nations or people. And that those people at the end of a war become your responsibility. If you read in the Seerah, you always hear about the Prophet ﷺ carrying people back to Medina and bringing them into the society in Medina. Safiya bint Huyay was in the enemy camp. And she comes into the society as a first-class citizen. Rayhana, again, from an enemy camp, comes into Medina society as a first-class citizen and is living in the same housing as the rest of the Muslims? Yes, because you're being taken in war slavery as a POW has nothing to do with you as a person. It has to do with your position, not you as a person. Because you may have been brought out, you may have been dragged out, you may have been tricked. Maybe you even thought you were doing the right thing at the time, but you've been taken. If you look in the Quran, in surahs like Surah Al-Balad, Surah Al-Baqarah, there are numerous ayat about how to manumit slaves. Numerous ayat. And enjoining you to manumit slaves. There are over 7 to 8 different references in the Quran to manumitting and freeing slaves. Whenever companions would do things wrong and come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, I've done this, he'd say, free a slave. He was breaking the back of slavery. And one of the first things that Allah did is He forbade people in Surah Al-Baqarah to marry slaves. He forbade them to marry slaves. What was He doing? He was cutting off the supply line of the last 2 forms of slavery, race and serfdom. Cutting it off. Any slave that came to the Prophet ﷺ was freed. Bilal ibn Rabah was free. Salman al-Farisi, the Prophet ﷺ, harvested trees for 3 years to make the money to get the gold to free him. When Bilal was freed, some of the unbelievers were laughing and said, you've given us 20 pieces of gold. If only I had others, I would charge you for them. To which Abu Bakr's reply was, if you had 100 more, you asked for 100 more for Bilal, I would have brought it. Why? Because it's breaking the back of the institution of permanental and indentured slavery. And then when you get to Medina, you find in the latter stages former slaves being married to people that have always been free. And people of this caliber, you start to find these connections being made. Because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he came, he was not a product of his time. So he came freeing people. Now, some of the people that he freed would sometimes ask to become servants of his, not slaves, but servants in the sense of helping in his household. So there were people who mended his clothes, or people who were in charge of writing out letters because he couldn't read and couldn't write. So they'd write out letters. But any slave that he ran across, he freed them. And so he broke the back of the system. So by the time you get to the latter age where slavery is beginning to be broken as a system, then the doors open regarding marrying former slaves and so forth. Now, when the permanental slavery came in, that was the Atlantic slave trade, you must understand there is no reference in the Bible to freeing slaves. There is no reference in the 66 or 73 or 81 or the 109 books of whatever Bible you want to bring. There is no text enjoining freeing slaves. Do you know in all the books of fiqh, and four methods, there's a chapter called manumitting and freeing slaves? You're going to look at us, at Muslims, and tell us about slavery? 100 million disappear under your watch and we don't know where they've gone. Our people, when we brought back war slaves and brought them into our economy, that's why you can't find people within our economy that say, yes, we were brought over from war and then we became Muslim and we live in this particular side of town or we live in this particular type of area. You don't find that. The people are blended in. You don't find the Punjabi side of town in Karachi. You don't find the Mamluk side of town in Egypt. But interestingly enough, you find the black neighborhoods in Compton, Watts, Inglewood, and wouldn't you know it, those people are all former slaves. What does that say about the mentality of a people? That although they claim that those people are free, still keep them relegated. It says that those people are sick. You must understand the commentary that they had. There was a position they have within their book. This was the commentary up until Wilberforce and the abolitionist movement. So you may want to write this down. There was a doctrine called the curse of Ham. The book of Genesis, it is believed that Noah, the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, one day became drunk. Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. I just need to narrate this. And Imam Muwaffiquddin rahimahullah says it's permissible to narrate kufr as long as one is not attributing to himself and he doesn't believe in it. It's stated in the text that the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was drunk one day and disrobed and removed all of his clothes. He was laying in his room, stark naked, and his first son came in by the name of Ham and saw him naked. He went back to the two brothers, Sham and Yafeth, and reported the father's nakedness. The two came with a blanket and walked in backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. The next day, according to the document, the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam is purported to have woken up and said, "Blessed be Sham, blessed be Yafeth, but cursed be Ham, for he shall be and his children shall be the slaves of his brothers." The commentary to this in the Jewish religious writings and in early Christian sources up until the time of Wilberforce was that when Ham had smiled and did that to his father, that his lips became large and that his skin darkened and that his hair became curly and kinky. Now, superimpose that understanding upon a group of people. Remember, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation had just happened. So what's happened? For the first time in history, people in Christian Europe can read. They can read. And sanitation starts making a comeback. Now, in the course of that, this is some of the first literature they've read. And so that starts to form in their minds preconceived notions. And so there was a foreshadowing of the Atlantic slave trade in their religious literature because of how they viewed other people. We still see they have terms now about someone becoming Muslim. He's turned Turk. He's gone native. Belligerent homeless people are called street Arabs. If you're going to somewhere far out, it's called BFE, bum, and I can't pronounce the rest, Egypt. Right? Bum effed Egypt, right? What type of mentality, what type of people are we talking about here? But those are the type of people that you're dealing with. These are the people that have invented such colorful and inventive phrases as, quote, nigger knocking, hacky bashing. All these colorful expressions and signs of high culture and civilization these people have given us. And it was prefigured in their writings. So when these people arrive into the north of Africa and the Horn of Africa, and on their arrival, 15 languages go extinct and 20 civilizations wink out of existence, you kind of understand what's going on. Further to the Atlantic slave trade was something else that was significant. When they arrived and the Atlantic slave trade had begun, the Ottomans in their domain had already outlawed slavery. I'll say that again. The Ottomans in their domain had already outlawed slavery because they had an underground problem with people keeping mainly white slaves. Slavery of Africans was an issue. The Arabs would go, as my great-grandfather did, to Ireland, steal Irish people, work them to death in North Africa to build monuments or castles or haciendas or plantations. And that's really what happened. If you're going to blame the Arabs, one thing the Arabs weren't known for was stealing Africans. They stole whites. That's one of the things they were known for. And so the Ottomans had to come out with a big decree and specifically say, from this day forward, we categorically repudiate, renounce, and reject all forms of white slavery. No one's enslaving Africans out there. It's the whites that are being worked to death like horses and given potatoes to eat and they die. This is what was happening. That's the reality. Now, when the Atlantic slave trade began, as they came in and devoured these civilizations, you can't even remember what was there before. You often hear references made to Timbuktu when someone lives far away. Oh, he lives way out in Timbuktu. Especially from among Americans. He lives way out in Timbuktu. What it was is Timbuktu was very difficult to get to because it was a walled, expansive city. If you get the opportunity to do some research at a library or get some books on the ancient history of Timbuktu, still today, they've got over 15,000 manuscripts in Arabic and other languages. It was a budding metropolis, a Muslim metropolis. So when they arrived, they weren't just looking at the fact that these people have on the wrong headgear, but they're the wrong color as well. And so the process began of the Atlantic slave trade. Demolishing of language, demolishing of culture. Now this is the Horn and North of Africa. So what are the Ottomans doing? Invading. Sending in fleets of 50 and 60 and 100 ships. Who are the pirates? The Christians. This is piracy. The Ottomans classed it as terrorism. Interesting, that word. But they classed it as terrorism. And so there's annals. There's one annal of one of them being taken to the United States. And the Ottomans, one of their captains who happened to be from North Africa and was melanin enriched was kidnapped and taken aboard of a ship. He, to the surprise of his captors, overpowered two of them and shot them both with their revolver. After which the Ottomans came, took him back to their camp because he was one of their people. So you find in that time, the Atlantic slave trade, they would pack their ships full with the slaves. And the job was to get them across the Atlantic into Hispaniola, or the larger Antilles, which is the large Caribbean islands and small Caribbean islands, and into mainland United States. Now, some 100 million people over the next 300 years would die, be goaded into slavery, or die on what's called the Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean to South America and North America. As I mentioned, one of the reasons for this is that the Spanish, Portuguese, English extermination pogroms of native peoples in North, Central, and South America was wiping out any slave trade that would have come from the defeated peoples. Old commentaries on the curse of Ham were utilized for the job. It would be at this same time that invasion forces would set about annihilating Aztec, Toltec, Comanche, Onondaga, and thousands of other nations, complete with the destruction of manuscripts. It's so interesting that the Onondaga civilization, which was composed of 5 bands, subsets, 2 of them that were Muslim, that were using the Quran as a constitution, as a guidebook. The Onondaga, who referred to George Washington as Hanadagayas, village burner, they said that the savages never wrote. They had no written language. Well, how would you know that they had a written language? Because you destroyed everything. You're telling me that 100 million people, the Aztecs, the Toltec, the Inca, the Maya, none of them wrote, and we found their calendars, which are intricately written down, none of them wrote? Well, they said the same thing at first when they came to the Muslims of Egypt and seized the libraries. The Egyptian savages, they didn't write. But fortunately, we had more of ourselves than them as Muslims, and were able to overpower them and get the manuscripts back. But they weren't as fortunate. So a lot of their history was destroyed. And their academia, who are the inheritors of the Atlantic slave trade that was done to replace the people that they annihilated, carry on the charade that these were just stark naked red savages. They couldn't read. Let's talk about some of the people that came out there that made it a necessity for the Atlantic slave trade to happen. The first is Hernán Cortés de Monroy y Pizarro. He was the first Marquis, and he lived between 1485 to 1547 of the Kafir calendar. He was a conquistador, a conqueror. And he was responsible for the annihilation of the Aztec Empire. Completely annihilated them. All right? Now, you may want to write this down. It's totally up to you if you want to. Hernán Cortés, he's generally known as Hernando Cortés, was responsible for the annihilation of the Aztec Empire and subjugated mainland Mexico. The people today that you are calling Mexico, or the people that you are calling Mexicans, most of them speak Nahuatl and are Aztecs, which is why the Spanish of people from Mexico was different to the Spanish of people from mainland Spain, right? So you'll find someone saying in mainland Spain, coche, for car. But the Chicano or the Mexican says carro, for car. You find Chicano words and Mexican words being used, like the word for the city of Chicago. Chicago, in Chicano Spanish, Chicago means toilet. And I can assure you, having traveled through there, that it is one. Now, the The situation with Hernan Cortes, he comes and begins the process of, first of all, after seeing massive temples of gold and a hugely stratified society, he begins the extermination process, passing out poison blankets, poisoning and contaminating their water supply, raping local women, and generally just being a menace. After all the devastation and murder, they realize we have no slaves left to work the land that we need to harvest the sugarcane and other plants. Now what are we going to do? So they moved further north to attack other civilizations in the hope of enslaving them. And then they stumbled across something that the Aztecs had already had, the coca leaf. The coca leaf. The grandmother of crack cocaine. It's from this tree that chocolate and cocaine both come from. This tree. And they stumbled across it. And things really began to change. An interesting book on Cortes, and I'm going to quote people who are actually either eyewitnesses or scholarly journals that are not pretty. One is Bernal Diaz de Castillo. He wrote the book, The Conquest of New Spain. And it's so interesting because Hernan Cortes, almost none of his monuments in Mexico survive. It's almost like the Mexican people have obliterated them. They found only 2, one of which is etched in stone and has security lighting all around it. But it's always getting defaced. Why? Because the Aztecs or the Chicano or the Mexican people, they don't like it. The Mexica, they don't like it. The Quechua, they don't like it. The Pueblo, they don't like it. So it's important. The next person that came was Francisco Pizarro y Gonzalez. He was another conqueror. From 1476 to 1541, another conquistador who slaughtered the Incan Empire and founded the city of Lima in modern-day Peru. These people are heroes. Their statues are in those countries. Could you imagine? Just think for just a second. A statue in this city commemorating Hitler and his accomplishments. The memorial plaque at the bottom. This is dedicated to our great commander and colleague, Adolphus Hitler, the Führer of the Third Reich, 1889 to 1945. God bless Hitler. You'd be stunned if you saw something like that. People would not know what to do. What's this doing here? Or, in Baghdad, a statue dedicated to Genghis Khan, our noble master. What's that doing there? No one would allow that. No one would allow that. But this has happened. So Lima, Peru, the actual capital city, is named and built and established by this cold-blooded killer. You have another, Ferdinand Magellan. He was born 1480. And he was, although sailing, he was the one responsible. He was actually from Portugal. He was responsible for bringing Roman Catholicism to the Philippines. Wait a minute. What religion were the people in the Philippines before Roman Catholicism was there? Well, the same religion as Indonesia. Same religion as the Malays, Islam. Now, fast forward into history. So then, what's this thing about the Moro-Islamic insurgency or rebellion? It's not an insurgency. These are the leftovers of the original majority fighting the settlers and conquerors and resisting them. Make sense now? I hope so. Because the hindsight of history gives you the ability to understand people better. Again, we have literature written about Ferdinand by Fernando Oliveira, The Voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, by the National Historical Institute. based on original Portuguese manuscripts. All the murderous rampages. He even died in the Philippines. Right? He even died in the Philippines. Now, it would be in this same time, as I mentioned, invasion forces set about annihilating Aztec, Toltec, Comanche, Onondaga, thousands of other nations, complete with the destruction of manuscripts. By the 1350s, it would be the case that native populations in the New World would stand at 95% less than those present during the arrival of Christopher Columbus. That means we've had a knockoff rate of 95%. What, did they all move? They couldn't have gone to Siberia. There's not enough space. Where did they go? They were exterminated. They were exterminated. The Khalifa of the Muslims, Murad III, died in 1006 AH and passed the Khilafah to Muhammad III, the 13th Ottoman Khalifa. Some historical accounts record him as being uncompromisingly treacherous and having many of his brothers and sisters killed if he feared disloyalty. Muhammad al-Thalith, the third, often left his mother, Sophia Sultan, in charge of the rule if he was away on business. So again, we see the Ottomans headed towards the same direction as the Abbasids and the Umayyads. They start becoming worldly leaders. There starts to develop that gulf between them and the scholars again. There start to be the arrest, the executions, and the other thing. There starts to be the persecutions, the pogroms. There starts to develop that chasm, that valley between the scholars and these earthly rulers who start becoming potentates, tyrants, autocrats, and dictators. Same thing we saw is now digging into the Ottomans. Muhammad III died in 1014 AH, leaving the Khilafah to his son Ahmed II. Ahmed was weak, and his reign was known for its capitulations and loss of territories to other powers. Imagine being in Belgrade under Muslim rule, and then all of a sudden you find out that the Christians have been given control over the area and they build a huge wall to block you off from the rest of the world. That's how difficult it was for Muslims when these things happened. When tobacco was first brought by unbelievers to the Muslim world in the year 1016 AH, more than 89 scholars from the four schools gave fatwa that it was not permissible, i.e. haram. This fatwa would later be buried by colonial authorities to the point where now some Muslims make a difference between heroin, speed, crack cocaine, opium on one side, and cigarettes and other habits on the other. So you have ulama like Al-Allama Umar Anitab, who wrote a book called The Manuscript Written to Show the Impermissibility of Smoking. Another book written by Sheikh Muhammad Mar'ishi, A Message Regarding the Ruling on the Impermissibility of Smoking. Question and Answer Regarding Smoking, written by Imam Nuh Afendi Mustafa Al-Rumi Al-Hanafi. A book called The Good Word Between the Brothers Regarding Those Who Give the Ruling that Smoking is Permissible, by Sheikh Al-Nabulsi. Another book written by an alim warning those who are heedless in the impermissibility of smoking, by Sheikh Muhammad ibn Ali al-Jamali al-Maghribi al-Maliki. Another book, A Message Regarding the Impermissibility of Smoking, by Imam Abdul Malik ibn Jamal al-Isami, the great Maliki scholar. Another book, Message Regarding Smoking, by Imam Sheikh Nasruddin Ibrahim ibn Ibrahim al-Laqani, who said it was impermissible. Another book called The Far-Reaching Answer to the Bold Question Regarding Smoking, written by Imam Nuruddin Ali al-Maliki. Another book, The Far-Reaching Proof in Establishing the Impermissibility of Smoking, by Imam Sulaiman ibn Muhammad al-Maliki. The Advice to the Brothers Regarding the Impermissibility of Smoking and the Compulsory Nature of Avoiding It, by Imam Burhanuddin Ibrahim al-Maliki. Another book written by Breaking the Desires Regarding Those Who Lust After Tobacco, written by Imam Alawi ibn Ahmad al-Shafi'i. Advising the brothers and refuting whoever even speaks of tobacco by Sheikh Ahmed ibn Abd al-Aziz al-Maliki. Advising people regarding the impermissibility of smoking by Imam Salama ibn Hassan al-Radi al-Shadhli, the great Maliki. Another book, The Impermissibility of Tobacco by Imam Mahmud ibn Salama al-Maliki. Another book, The Clear Proofs Regarding the Impermissibility of Tobacco by Imam Muhammad ibn Salman al-Maliki. There are some 89 and more names here. Mar' ibn Yusuf al-Karmi, great Hanbali alim, who wrote on this topic, also narrated a story from one of the ulama in Arabiya, in which the ulama told someone that was smoking to put it out, and they said it is not impermissible, and those ulama said, say La ilaha illallah. They made him retake his shahada. This is how serious it was viewed. Nowadays, because of a number of factors, there are people who will say it's not a big issue. It's makruh, it's this, it's that. We actually have the year that it came into the Muslim world, the year 1016 AH. We have the year that it came into the Muslim world. No, it is a big deal. It's just a big deal as just as much a big deal as crack, just as much a big deal as speed, heroin, snuff, whatever. It's just as big a deal. And it mustn't be taken lightly. I know there are some who take it lightly. But the ulama in that case considered it serious enough to make someone retake their shahada for even suggesting. That's how serious this matter is. And these are the names of these ulama. I mean, you can see they're from all, most of the ulama I quoted were either Malikis or Hanafis, the first set of them. But there's other ulama, Hanbali ulama, Shafi'i ulama. Every single text, every single document, there are some 90 scholars saying virtually the same thing. That means we have our work cut out for us, because we have been told, because of the prevalence of something, because something is prevalent, and because something is present, doesn't mean that it's halal. Fornication is prevalent. We don't say, well, alhamdulillah, some alim out there somewhere will give the fatwa. Maybe. But he's an alim of the dunya, not one of the akhirah. Something being prevalent doesn't mean it's halal. Even if, because these ulama were noting and breaking down things, one of the ulama stating that those that are indulging in smoking, one of the proofs for it being impermissible, this is before electron microscopy. He says one of the proofs of it being impermissible is those that smoke imitate the sunnah of the people of Jahannam. And he quoted numerous ayat and ahadith that mention smoke coming out of the noses and mouths of the kuffar in the fire. He says this alone is enough proof. This alone before anything else. One of the ulama, Imam Abdul Rahman al-Buhuti, said the smell that comes from the mouth of such a one who does so is putrescent. Stinks. Putrescent. Meaning so foul as to resemble excrement. Putrescent. What a word. But it captures the strength of what it means. It captures what this resembles. So you must understand, no matter what happens around us, it is not for us to say, well, what can we do? No, it's you to say, what can I do? How should I carry myself? How should I conduct myself? Because tobacco is a big issue. They didn't just give a ruling. They gave a ruling on tenbak or nabagh, tobacco. And nabagh is, the tenbak is the sharb al-dukhan, it's the actual ingesting of the smoke. But the nabagh is taking of the tobacco in any form, chewing it, snuffing it. Nabagh means to take tobacco, to either chew it, to liquefy it, or any use for tobacco like that. It's impermissible. 89 scholars. I mean, this book here that I've got is the earliest fatwa written about it. And this book, in discussing all the proofs of it being impermissible, this book by Mar' ibn Yusuf al-Karmi, this book is 169 pages long. This one fatwa on smoking. It's not about fiqh. It's not about tafsir. It's not about raising the hands. It's not about the people that don't do mawlid. It's not about that. It's about, what about this disease of the speakeasies, the backgammon, the hashish, the smoking? Here it is. People say, well, there's a difference between the fuqaha. What difference? What fuqaha? Who? Find that person. Individual needs his head checked. Because the ulama spoke about this 1016 AH. That's the 1600s. Subhanallah. So we have to be very, very careful when we look at these matters, because the ulama have spoken clearly. It may be hard for you. Subhanallah, it's hard for me, or I can't just go cold turkey. Fine, go warm turkey. Whatever. Do whatever you need to do. But do it. Oh, it's going to be hard for me. Yes, and there's a lot of other things that are hard for other people. But you've got to do them. Someone says, well, all my friends around me do. Well, then you'll have to tell them, I'm turning over a new leaf. Try to influence them. If they influenced you, you've got to influence them. And the way that things are headed, you have to stand outside in the rain to do it anyway. And you look like a little bit of a chucklehead or a sucker standing out in the rain anyway. So you might as well quit anyway. Save 50 pounds a month, 10 pounds a week, several hundred a year. Pick up something else. Pick up a new habit. Right? So this is why these ulama did this during the Ottoman era. Look at all of what the Ottomans gave us. These type of ulama. Now further to this, we also look and we see the year 1028 AH came and brought the death of Ahmed I, the 14th Khalifa of the Muslims. The 15th Khalifa was Mustafa I, the brother of Ahmed I. He suffered from stress and acute mental disorders and was deposed in 1029, but was then reinstated from 1030 to 1031 and had some following after having his nephew Uthman II killed after he'd been ruling in his place. In 1150 AH, Mustafa was removed by force, and his younger brother Murad IV came to be the 16th Khalifa of the Muslims. After seeing some of the excesses that had occurred before under some previous Ottoman rulers, Murad IV became very strict, autocratic, and conservative. Remember, these are Central Asian Hanafis. Their response to seeing widespread corruption was to do what? To tighten down the fence, to break down the things. And anybody that seemed like they were doing fitna, break him down. Any books or anything that would seem to lead people astray, break them down. And that's why you see the Central Asian Hanafis are so conservative. Because their response to these type of things is to crack down on it. We've got to stop this. We've got to return order. But the difficulty now for the Central Asian Hanafis is they have no way of restoring order because they don't have a centralized government. So they're very strict, but they have no way to impose their order. And so the Central Asian Hanafis come into other areas, or they come into the rest of the Muslim world, or they come into the areas where the kuffar lived, and it's difficult for them to practice the fiqh because they're so conservative, but it's sort of in a vacuum. And that's the difficulty that the Hanafi scholars, some of them, are facing today. Now, it was believed by the Khalifa that this was the best way to restore order and to preserve the system that was already in place, although weakening and decaying, because the Ottomans were starting to decay. He was assassinated in 1167 AH, and the 17th Ottoman Khalifa became Ibrahim I. Ibrahim I was assassinated in 1175 AH, and the Khilafah went to Muhammad IV, the 18th Ottoman ruler. Suleiman II became the 19th Khalifa when Muhammad IV died in 1214 AH. I'm just giving these numbers here because we're going to be talking about them further. I wanted to jump ahead regarding the Khalifas and then fill in more information regarding them. The year 1076 AH came with the Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Rasul al-Shahruzuri al-Barzanji, completing his work on the end times that gathered all up-to-date information to his time and beyond. The difference between previous works is he explained in detail using past text as a guide, which prophecies had been fulfilled before his time, in his time, and which were still pending. Now this is very important. So Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Rasul al-Shahruzuri al-Barzanji wrote a book on end time prophecy, on the Ashratu Sa'ah, the name of the book, the signs of the end of time. He gathered all of the literature from the early times, combined it together, and then broke it down into 4 subheadings. Prophecies that had already come to pass before his time. Prophecies that had come to pass immediately before his time. Prophecies that were coming to pass in his time. And prophecies that were still pending. Inshallah, if Allah preserves us, that is one of the books that we'll be using for the signs of the end of time. Also, Imam al-Barzanji, he completed this work, and the layout of the book is immaculate. Whenever a prophecy is fulfilled, he will tell you what the hadith is, what the verse is, the year it was fulfilled. Sometimes he has full dates of when it was fulfilled, and what annals or historical documents he's referring to. Absolutely remarkable item. One of the great Shafi'i scholars of his time. In this time, we have Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf, who I mentioned in our last class to circle him and make reference to him because we're going to be talking about him. He was brought forward as the next chief judge of Arabiya. The Imam had made a number of commentaries on fiqh texts and was preparing them for release. Now this Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf, was a student of Imam Muhammad al-Ushayqiri. These were alims, these were ulama who were coming from Arabiya, deep in central Arabiya. And they would go and study in Egypt, in Sham, and other places and take the knowledge back. So as we remember, Ahmed ibn Atwa was made the first qadi over all of Arabiya. Then we had Muhammad al-Ushayqiri, who was after him. Then you had Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf. Now, in his time, he was the qadi over all of Arabiya. He had written a commentary on a number of works. But he hears that his sheikh, Imam Mansur ibn Yunus al-Buhuti in Egypt, has written a commentary on one of the seminal fiqh texts. One of his students tells him this. When he heard that, he gathered all of his fiqh books together, burned them, and said, only follow what Imam Mansur al-Buhuti has put in his books. Don't follow mine. Just follow what he put in his books because he is our teacher. That ruling has still impacted the Gulf, the Khalij of Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. To this day, the books that are used for legal principles are not just the Zad al-Mustaqni' or other things. Specifically, it's the commentaries of Imam Mansur al-Buhuti. Because of that one incident that happened more than 300 years ago, still the Gulf insist on using Mansur al-Buhuti's commentaries. The books may be the same. So someone coming from Sham is using Mar'i ibn Yusuf al-Karmi. But the Khalijis are using Mansur al-Buhuti because of that incident. And this great alim who wrote the book Al-Manasik on the Hajj and other things, how to visit the grave of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how to do shafa'ah with the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This alim, Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf, he is the grandfather of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of the Salafi movement. You may want to circle that because this comes up significantly later. This is the grandfather of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Salafiyah. The founder. And Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf is the father of the next Grand Qadi. And the next Grand Qadi after him, who inshallah we'll discuss in the next class, is Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman al-Najdi. He was an alim, Qadri in his tariqah, and the father of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, but his teaching licenses were all put in his oldest son, Sulaiman ibn Abdul Wahhab, the older brother of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, and the greatest opponent of Salafiyah in that time, and the first to write a book against Salafiyah. So inshallah we will be discussing that further in later lessons, inshallah. Now we talk about deaths during this time. We have Zainuddin Abdul Rahman ibn Muhammad ibn Farfur, the great Hanafi Qadi of Sham. The Farfur family is still highly prized today. The Farfurs are still in Sham, in Damascus. They're a major family. They are one of the, when you hear certain names, Maydani, Farfur, when you hear names like that and they're giving fatwa or what have you today for the Hanafis, those are the people you listen to that are alive. When you hear those names, these are people that aren't just, they're not just sheikhs, they're not just muftis, they're qadis. They're qadis. The Farfurs give fatwa for all of Sham. Right? The Farfurs are a famous family. Further to this, we have Abu Sa'adat, Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Ali al-Fakihi al-Makki, the Hanbali judge, Shihabuddin Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Sindi, Hanafi scholar of Hadith, Rahmatullah ibn Abdullah al-Sindi. All of these scholars died in 992 AH. We also have Jamaluddin Muhammad ibn Sadiq al-Hanafi, who was one of the few Hanafi scholars to come from Yemen, who died in 996 AH. Reason why he's one of the few is because of the fact that Yemen is primarily Shafi'i. So there are few Hanafi scholars that are based in Yemen. There are a few in some of the highlands of Yemen. There are some Hanafi scholars, but not enough to sort of make a madrasa or to sort of go there and study it consistently. There just aren't enough. Because in order to study something, it has to be in demand. So you have Muslim brothers that have been to Sham, and there weren't more than 8 students. So the sheikh comes in and says, there aren't enough of you to study Hanafi fiqh, so you're all going to study Shafi'i fiqh for the next 2 years. And I'm like, subhanAllah, we come here to study Hanafi fiqh, yeah, but there aren't enough of you, so what do you want me to do? The Shafi'i country, what do you want? This area is a Shafi'i country. Now, listen, I'm going to hand out the books now, and he just handed out the books, and for 2 years, there was nothing they could do, because it's not his fault. It has to do with the demand. So if you don't have enough people, then you can't build up a madrasa, and you can't build up a following among the people. And that's the difficulty that they had in Yemen. They were never able to establish. One of the places that you'll find has few people upon the Hanafi school is Arabia and Yemen. Well, Yemen is part of Arabia, but some people consider it separate. That's a place where the Hanafi school has never really been able to get a proper foothold. Even during the Ottomans, which were expansive builders, the Abbasids, for whatever reason, it could never get a really strong foothold. And when you look at the mihrabs around the Kaaba in the old pictures, the smallest one is the Hanafi one because it had the least people that were resident there in Mecca. Not because of any inferiority, but just it had to do with demand and supply. Whereas when you look at Istanbul, the pavilion for the Hanafi, it's gigantic. It's huge. Why? Because all this money was put into it, and they were safeguarded, and they were the vast majority of that city. The Turkish today, by and large, are Hanafis. There's nothing else of that, with the exception of the Kurds that are immediately north to them, by and large, Shafi'is. So it has to do with supply and demand. You had Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Ushayqiri, who was the second chief judge of Arabiya. He died in 1012 AH. Imam Ahmed ibn Muhammad al-Ushayqiri, he memorized the books Al-Iqna', Zad al-Mustaqni', Arud al-Murbi', and some 6 others, which is about 11 volumes. He memorized that. So when he came back as a qadi, he was really well-grounded. Very, very well-grounded. Al-Ushayqir. Another one was Imam Badruddin Muhammad al-Balbani. He died in 1033 AH. His book, Mukhtasar al-Ifadat, is one of the chief books for studying comparative creed. It's one of the skeleton texts for studying, if you want to study comparative creed within Ahl Sunnah, between Hanbalis, Ash'aris, and Maturidis. That book is one of the skeleton manuals. Mukhtasar al-Ifadat is also called the Mukhtasar. It's also called the Mukhtasar al-Nihaya by Ibn Hamdan. It's also called the Mukhtasar of that. That is one of the books that you would study because it gives you a greater understanding of these branch differences between Ash'aris, Maturidis, and Hanbalis. He also credits once he had gone blind. He lost his vision, and he saw Imam Ahmed rahimahullah in a dream, and he said, "Please pray for me." And Imam Ahmed said, "Inshallah, I will. What do you want me to pray to Allah for about? Pray that Allah restores my vision." And so we did, and when he woke up, he could see. So we see the dua is important. Dua is very, very important. And the righteous people, if there's someone that's righteous, you ask them to make dua for you. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it's within His eternal will, He answers. Another is Mar'i ibn Yusuf al-Karmi. He died in 1044 AH. Mar'i ibn Yusuf al-Karmi is the writer of this book regarding tobacco. He's a writer of numerous other documents. He wrote another skeleton text called Aqawil al-Thiqat, which is a comparative text, but it's a advanced to senior level comparative creed text between the 3 schools among Ahl Sunnah, Ash'aris, Hanbalis, and Maturidis. It's a comparative document, and it's very hefty. And really, you shouldn't read that until you've read the Nihaya, the Mukhtasar al-Nihaya, the Luma'a, and Al-Ain wal-Athar. Then you read that, because it's quite hefty. A lot of the references don't make sense, or you misread them unless you've read them properly in their context. Another is Mansur ibn Yunus al-Buhuti. He died in 1050 AH. Again, a big judge. He learned from Yahya ibn Musa al-Hajjawi, who was the son of Imam Musa al-Hajjawi. Another alim who died in this time was Umar ibn Muhammad ibn Fatuh al-Bayquni, Shafi'i scholar in Hadith sciences. He died in 1080. His book, the Bayquniyah, if you study Hadith in many places, his book, it's called the Manzuma al-Manzumatul Bayquniyah. It's an introduction to the sciences of Hadith and the study of Hadith. What is Sahih, what's not Sahih. Most of the places that you study, that will be the book that you'll use, the Bayquniyah. In a lot of the places in the Muslim world, if people have studied it, like you'll find people studied in Damascus, they studied it in Cairo, they study it in Indonesia, in Jakarta, they studied in Kuala Lumpur, a lot of places. I don't know if it's most places, but a fair few places. That is the book, the Bayquniyah, in Hadith sciences, is used for study. Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf al-Najdi, we already talked about him, the 3rd judge of Arabiya after Ahmed ibn Atwa. He died in 1079 AH. And then we have Muhammad ibn Abdul Rasul al-Shahrazuri al-Barzanji. He died at 1102 AH, and we'll be coming to further that. We'll be coming further to that later. Now, it's interesting because in Imam al-Barzanji's book called Ashratu Sa'a, there are numerous ahadith by the Prophet ﷺ about Hajj being prevented near the end of time. And Imam al-Barzinji, rahimahullah, he said, this has only happened partially. He said there have been times where people have prevented people from Sham coming when the Karramiyya took over, or the Qaramita took over. The full prophecy where Hajj was prevented was not realized until the time of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, in which Hajj was stopped for 2 years. And we'll be coming to that inshallah next week. So it's very important. He said this one is still pending. We live in the time after it. We've already lived. We lived to see, or we lived past the time of Mecca being shelled, the curtains of the Kaaba being burned. That happened. That's already happened. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab already did that. Medina being shelled and the people being made to eat the dogs of Medina. That happened. Medina was shelled. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab surrounded the gates, made the people eat the dogs, starved them out. Right? Hajj being stopped for 2 years. That was in a newspaper in this country, the United Kingdom. They couldn't believe it. They said the one of the greatest of the Mohammedan festivals has been interrupted by a band of extremists. So this is the reality. And so a lot of what's coming next week, inshallah, has to do with prophetic incidents that are occurring. Before closing immediately, I just wanted to mention some of the literature that I depended on and will depend on for further discussion about the United States. If you want to really understand the extermination programs, what Columbus and those others did when they arrived, and how absolutely bestial they were, this book by Ward Churchill, A Little Matter of Genocide, very exhaustive. The bibliography, over 500 sources. Over 500 sources. The place where the footprints of the World Trade Center tower stand is where some of the settlers played kickball with the heads of some of the Aboriginal peoples in the U.S. Had a game of kickball with their heads. Right? Very good book. Another book is called Comanches, The History of a People by T.R. Fehrenbach. He makes the following analysis, which again, you have to understand the American psyche. You have to become students of Occidentalism, the study of the West, to understand the mindset of the people that we're dealing with. Listen to this encouraging quote on page 13. Quote, "This is the story of the Nermanu, or people, a few thousand North American Indians, from their prehistoric beginnings to the destruction as an independent people, to their destruction as an independent people. In one sense, the passage of the people was of little importance, a minor footnote to American history." It's the destruction of more than 60,000 people. It's a minor footnote in American history. After all, there's 300 million in here now, and we've got McDonald's and Wendy's, and someone had to give it up in order for us to make it here now. Right? Very good book. Another book is called Slave Nation, How Slavery United the Colonies and Sparked the American Revolution, showing that the United States was built on slavery, and the way that the United States was able to power itself and get independence was to use slavery as a crutch. Very good book. They were denounced numerous times, but all the sources are unimpeachable. Amazing book. 2 lawyers, 2 Harvard lawyers. Amazing, amazing book. I think you'll find those 3 to fortify your knowledge and give you a greater understanding of the American psyche, particularly the American psyche of slaughter, encroachment, and reinforcement and values clarification. It's okay we slaughtered these 100 million guys because it worked out at the best for everyone in the end. Because what would we have done without McDonald's? Could you imagine life without Baskin Robbins? So it all worked out for the best and for everyone else. And this is how they viewed the world. Finally, I want to mention very quickly about conquest. There are 3 forms of conquest. There are 3 forms of conquest, and because we're going to be talking about this. There is a conquest there is the first type, which is called conquest and rebuilding. This form of conquest is where someone comes into a nation, they take over that nation, and they rebuild it and incorporate that nation into their own. I've only seen the Muslims do this in history. I've never seen anyone else incorporate another nation. I've seen nations disappear. I've never seen them incorporate. I've seen them exterminated, but I've never seen them incorporated. So the Muslims left these civilizations in place. That's why the two main relics of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Nativity, they're still there, right in the heart of the Muslim world. Where's the main Muslim masjid that's still standing from antiquitous times in what we're calling Spain or Portugal today? You know, in Portugal, there aren't any. You think that for 950 years, no one was there. There must have been some rain. No, there was no rain. They destroyed every single last vestige of Islam. You can't even find any manuscripts. It's gone. What, the Muslims didn't write while they were there? Couldn't have. Ignorant savages. Couldn't have written. That's the behavior you have to think about. That's the first type of... So the first type of conquest is incorporating them. They're taken, but they're incorporated. So they're rebuilt. The second type of conquest is protectorate conquest. Again, you don't colonize these people. They become a protectorate of yours. They become your ally. And if they're your ally and they accept your supremacy, they pay you either tribute or they allow you to use their waterways or their trade. But you don't colonize them, you don't attack them. This is the case for the Gulf countries, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Arabia. They've not been colonized. There wasn't a big encroachment, massive enslavement. They made them change their clothes, their culture. They completely reconfigured them as a people. They didn't do that. There may be cultural norms that seeped in, but there was not a wholesale massive invasion. Number one, how are you going to get across the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter? It's too hot. You don't have the troops. Number two, until oil was found, it wasn't seen as strategically important. Right? So that's the second type, is protectorate. Bahrain was a protectorate until 1971. Right? They weren't colonized, but they were held as a protectorate. You accept British sovereignty in this area and that we're the chief power, we'll protect you. You pay us tribute, we won't kill you. And life is good. The third type is what is called parasitic conquest. Parasitic conquest. Yes, it comes from the same root as parasite. Parasitic conquest. This is where when you conquer a people and you don't build up the civilization that you've taken over, but you use it to feed off of it and to build your own civilization, using it as a husk to power your own civilization. This is primarily what was used in the Atlantic slave trade when they invaded places, used their natural resources, absorbed them, and didn't build anything else up. Timbuktu is in ruins today, is it not? Of course it is. Why? Parasitic conquest. Parasitic conquest. Think of all the places, Angola, Mozambique. They speak Portuguese there. Of course, well, of course they do. Why are they in such rough straits? Parasitic conquest. Did they build up those places? Where are the buildings that they built up? Nothing. Build up anything. The Caribbean, parasitic conquest. United States, parasitic conquest. Central America, South America, the Philippines, parasitic conquest. Feeding off the people until finally, when you've exhausted the natural resources, they're either exterminated or enslaved. Out of 100 million people, there's now 2 million of the original Native Americans in the North American United States. That's a reduction of over 95%. Let the mathematicians reflect on that. Wait a minute, hold on. And do your computations. It's a lot of people gone. Yes. So that's a heavy number. So you need to think about those three types of conquest, because we'll start to see them playing out, especially with the Atlantic slave trade, Portuguese expansion. Now the Portuguese are quite quiet, and you think, oh, they're such a timid people, it's such a small nation. Do your history. Do your history. This is a small nation, and they're quiet now. But do your history. Because just because you're small doesn't mean you can't cause problems. A chipped tooth is small, it can cause problems. Cancer is small, but it can cause problems. Never think, oh, because they're a small nation, they didn't do anything. You always have to think carefully, because these nations that are small, in their time, they were major maritime powers. And they spent their time, as we'll see inshallah next week, carving up Africa and deciding, okay, this is mine. You had a king in Germany who had a section of Central Africa that he'd never even been to that was his property. Belgian Congo. There's no Belgian people that live there. But it's theirs. And they made those people learn Belgian. People in Africa that speak French better than French people. And then they go to France and get beat up by skinheads. Or something happens to them. Why? Because they have not been able to move outside of the standpoint that they are colonized not just physically, but mentally. You really damage a people when you take their language from them. And so that's why I say, I don't care what language it is. I often joke about this many times, but I'm serious. Whether it's Urdu, whether it's Arabic, whether it's Afrikaans, I don't care what it is. You should speak another language besides English. Do not assume that this is just the golden age. You should speak another language besides English, because it opens your mind. It gives you a different perspective, and it keeps you from being enslaved to anyone else. Does it ever make you wonder why the Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Brotherhood, the East Side White Pride, these are all formed by English-speaking people who put the adjective first before the noun? Black man, white man. Why do you think it's made these type of people? Or are there some quiet underground Arab clansmen we haven't seen? No, because there's an underground subcurrent. Language is the thought of a people. And if you take people's ability to think in their own language, you've taken their ability to think from them. And that's one of the first things the invasion forces did, is to take their ability to think. You cannot speak your language in class. If you do, you are punished. It takes away your ability to think. Hold on to your language, whatever it is, and don't let go of it. أقول قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم أستغفر الله إن الله غفور رحيم يرحمني الراحمين. Now we've covered a lot of area in a short period of time. I did not think I was going to make it, but alhamdulillah I did. Now I realize there must be something that I've left out somewhere. Maybe some point needs to be elucidated. Are there questions from the believers? Yes, brother.
I've got a question in regards to Sheikh al-Najdi and Sheikh bin Baz. And you know, like, obviously he comes from Riyadh. And we were talking about in the seerah before, and that Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, beware of the people that fitna will rise from them. So do you know, it's like all the, like you briefly mentioned Salafi scholars and stuff like that, or Salafi earlier on. Have they not come across this hadith that, like, if anyone comes from Riyadh or anywhere and Najd, and Shaitan came in the form of the man, like to try to the Asian in the form of Sheikh Najdi, have they not come across this hadith before that fitna will rise from?
The question is, have not people of Salafiyah, whether they're in that cult or their leadership, come across a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ disparages Najd, or the things of Najd, or the fitna that's to come from Najd? Alhamdulillah. Yes, they have. But when you look in their biographical literature, you will find that the Seerah of Ibn Hisham that contains that part is often edited, in which case it's been either purified, as they quote, or it's been abridged. It's mukhtasar, an abridgment. The second thing that's done is they say that Najd in this sense is referring to Iraq. So when the Prophet ﷺ is saying, "Oh Allah, bless our Yemen and bless our Sham," And what about our Najd, Messenger of Allah? He says, that is a place of earthquakes and fitna. Well, that's Iraq. There's a number of reasons why this is mistaken. Number one, the companions at that time had not made it to Iraq. The Muslims and the Arabs had not gone to Iraq yet. So they couldn't be talking about Iraq because the Muslims hadn't made it there yet. So why would they be making dua for a land where there weren't any Muslims there yet? There weren't any people there yet that belonged to Islam. Number two, as you rightly mentioned, the Sheikh al-Najdi is coming from where? From the Najd region. And no one understood him as coming from Iraq. No one. They understood him as coming from the Najd that people understood. Not only this, the Prophet ﷺ, when he said it, he actually faced the place where the sun rises up, which is east of Medina. Iraq is further north. He would have faced further north. He actually turned around to demonstrate, to make us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, understand what he was talking about. He actually faced that region and then pointed to it and made reference to it. Now, I don't know how much clearer you need to be in order to make someone understand this, but that is a place of fitna and earthquakes. And it was mentioned by the historian Ibn al-Imad, the earthquakes and aerial disturbances. That's a place of fitna and earthquakes. So in general, what they tend to do is do one of two things. They either edit those things, and the commentaries that would discuss them, they remove. Or number three, they said this is referring to Iraq. Now, a lot of the books by scholars that have written against it, they have tried to burn, obfuscate, or cover up. And that's why, inshallah, we've translated it into English, and inshallah, hopefully by the end of this year of the Kafir calendar, the book will be out, and you'll be able to read what 60 scholars have said about this organization, so you can make a proper decision. So we want to put these things into English so that people who are following Salafiyah, that speak English as their tongue of conversation or their mother tongue, can actually look at these documents. But yes, it's a good point you've brought. It's often something that's covered up, and that's why they don't make reference to it. There's another question. Yeah.
Slightly following on to that, so that basically we haven't covered Abdul Wahhab at the moment.
Uh-huh.
So do you know it's like Salafiyah is not in this region of Jazirat al-Arabiya at this moment in time.
Not yet.
So the whole of the Arabian Peninsula is basically Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah.
That's correct. So the question is during this time before the rise of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, was all the peninsula upon the creed of Muslim orthodoxy? The answer to that question is yes. But just before Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, the Khawarij would revivify. First in Yemen. There was a man in Yemen with the name Muhammad al-Amir al-Sana'ani. And he died in 1182 AH. He was the one to revivify the teachings of the Khawarij. Some of these books fell into the hands of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab while he was traveling to different places. And he began to build his own theology. And he actually went much further than Muhammad al-Amin al-Sana'ani. Muhammad al-Amin al-Sana'ani said that the following the madhabs was shirk, and most of the ummah was involved in major shirk. And he said that they didn't even know what tawheed was. He declared himself an absolute mujtahid. So he wrote books called Ijtihad Made Easy and different things like this, which, you know, it's saddening. Muhammad Abdul Wahhab went further, though, and said that the vast majority of the ummah were worshipping idols. And they did not know what tawheed was until we had to come and re-explain tawheed to them again. In which case, the ulama of Muslim orthodoxy, right when they heard that, they said, then you are a false prophet. Because if all this time there was no faith until you came, that means we're in another jahiliyyah. And the only jahiliyyah that we knew before was lifted by the Prophet ﷺ. So you are a false prophet. And all of the scholars around them classed him as a false prophet and said that he was a disciple of Musaylima al-Kadhab. So we'll be coming, inshallah, to that next week.
So
Yes.
one more question.
Yes.
That. Do you know, you mentioned earlier on about Abdul Wahhab, and do you know, like his great grandfather, and you mentioned someone else. The authority was given to his older brother to basically be the scholar, but he was the one who was kind of. Was he Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah? His older brother.
Okay. Question is regarding Sulaiman ibn Abdul Wahhab and the family, the Al-Musharraf family. Alhamdulillah. Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf was the grandfather of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Imam Sulaiman ibn Ali al-Musharraf had a son named Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman al-Najdi, who was an alim and was the qadi after him. Abdul Wahhab ibn Sulaiman had two sons, Muhammad and Sulaiman the elder. Sulaiman the elder went and studied and learned his knowledge. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab went and studied briefly, but did not receive any teaching licenses, authorizations, or any textual authority from the scholars of his time. And he began to build his own theology and read on his own a lot. Whereas while he was doing that, Sheikh Suleiman had been to Zubair, he'd been to Egypt, he'd been to all these other places. So Muhammad Abdul Wahhab did not come from a family of necromancers or temple dancers or prostitutes. He came from a family of people who were upon the way of Muslim orthodoxy. But he, of his choice, decided that I am going to go my own way. I'm going to devise, and the main books that he depended upon were the books of Imams Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. But he didn't have all of those books. He only had extracts of them. And because of that, he made a number of mistakes regarding what is shirk. He redefined shirk. He redefined la ilaha illallah. He redefined kufr. He said there are three forms of shirk when there are actually only two. Right? He made numerous egregious mistakes. And inshallah, the book Divine Lightning, which is coming in late December, inshallah, it covers these. And so it's a long read. It's 614 notes. It's 224 pages or more. But I think it's important. And people are ready to read proper knowledge, inshallah. Is there another question? Yes, brother.
You mentioned a couple of weeks ago about Brazil being discovered by Muslims. The tribe, I think, called it Brasilia.
Brazil.
And Columbus had Muslims on his ship.
Mm.
And there being signs of Islam being in America before we got there. Just wondering if there's any textual evidence you can point me towards reference.
Question is regarding textual evidence of Muslims arriving in the United States and being there earlier than the people that discovered it. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. If you can find Barry Fell's books, Fell, he goes through a great amount of documentation. Another is written by a Native American scholar, Abdul Rahim Abdul Razak, who goes into detail using manuscripts and other documents showing how many tribes and bands and subsets of the native colonies of the United States were Muslim. Another example is Robert J. Allison, who wrote The Crescent Obscured, which shows you how concerned the early colonists were with Islam in the United States before they founded as a nation. You can also look up the Continental Congress under the 1787 treaty, which allows the people of Delaware to continue practicing their religion of Mohammedanism without molestation. They broke that treaty that same year. But the fact that they were mentioned is indicative that the people there had that religion. That's just a start. There are other documents, but that's just a start of something to whet your tongue. If you could get the whole Continental Congress, which is a layout of their conquest plan of the U.S., it's several volumes thick. It's about 7 volumes long, the Continental Congress. I think you can only get it. It's like 900 pounds or something crazy like that, and it's mainly scholars and high-level historians that buy it. But if you can find it online somewhere discounted, secondhand, or the Library of Congress, who have a lot of their manuscripts online, it's an option. Yes? Yes?
What was the Arabic name for Caribbean?
Qarib. the qarib. Question is, the Arabic name that was used for the people that were living there, the Qarib people, were called the qarib people, the near, because they were near to that coast where the Brazil people left from, so they called it the qarib people. Yes? Is there a final question?
You
Yes.
mentioned Imam Barzanji. Is it the same Imam Barzanji that wrote this that book, this book of Mawlid as well?
Alhamdulillah. Question is whether the Imam al-Barzanji is the same Barzanji Imam that wrote the book on the Mawlid. Alhamdulillah. Salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Allahu alam. I'm not sure. Because Barzanji, there's an Imam Barzanji that knew Imam Ahmad Rada Khan. So it shows that more than one person has this name Barzanji. I would need to check the name. But this particular one is Muhammad ibn Abdul Rasul Shahruzuri al-Barzanji. If that's the same name as this author that you're making reference to, then they're the same person. But I'm not sure. Yes? So inshallah, if that's the end of it, then we will close here inshallah. Hopefully next week we'll come together and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless us. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك إنه غفور رحيم ولا إله إلا الله.